"It is a pity the inkwell was so close to the gown, Elara," my stepmother, Baroness Marion, said, her voice a silken thread of false sympathy. "Such a clumsy girl you are." She gestured with a dismissive flick of her wrist at the disastrous bloom of midnight blue ink spreading across the bodice of the pale gray silk. It was my mother's gown, the only thing of quality I owned, altered to fit me. Now it looked as though it had been shot through the heart. My stepsister, Rosaline, stood beside her, a perfect porcelain doll of feigned concern. "Oh, Elara, what will you do? The Duke of Vance's ball is tonight. You cannot possibly go in a ruined dress." Her blue eyes, usually so vacant, held a glint of cruel triumph that she was not quite skilled enough to hide. It was her inkwell. It had been on her vanity, nowhere near the gown I had carefully laid out on my bed. An accident, they called it. An accident that felt as precise and calculated as a line drawn by a master architect. "Yah, she will wear it," my father murmured from the doorway, not quite meeting my eyes. He was a man made of shadows and regrets, long since hollowed out by Marion's relentless will. "It is in a dark corner. No one will notice. No one will notice." The motto of my existence. I was the inconvenient daughter, the quiet, plain relic of his first, more beloved wife. I was a footnote in my own home, a ghost at my own table. To be noticed was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny in Marion's world was a precursor to punishment. I had learned to master the art of invisibility, to press myself into the alcoves and fade into the tapestries of our life until I was nothing more than a whisper of displaced air. Tonight, however, I was to be a spectacle of shame. To be sent to the most important social event of the season in a stained gown was not merely an oversight, it was a statement. It was Marion marking her territory, ensuring everyone understood my place. I was less than nothing. I was refuse. I said nothing. I simply bowed my head, a gesture of submission they had long come to expect. Words were a currency I could not afford to spend. They were always twisted, turned against me, used as proof of my insolence or my ingratitude. My silence was my only shield, a thin and brittle thing, but my own. Inside, a familiar cold resignation settled in my chest. Hope was a dangerous luxury, a flickering candle in a house of drafts. I had learned years ago to snuff it out myself before the wind did it for me. The carriage ride was an exercise in practiced suffocation. Rosaline, radiant in a gown the color of crushed roses and dripping with jewels from Marion's personal collection, chattered endlessly about the Duke. "They say he is so severe," she whispered, though her tone was one of thrilled anticipation, not fear. "Utterly cold. He has not hosted a ball at Blackwood Manor in a decade, not since his brother died." "He is the most powerful man in the kingdom, darling," Marion replied, smoothing a stray lock of Rosaline's golden hair. "Severity in a man of his standing is a sign of substance. He has no time for frivolity. He is looking for a duchess, not a plaything. You must be demure, intelligent, and captivating." She shot a look at me, huddled in the corner of the carriage. "Everything Elara is not." I stared out at the passing darkness, the reflection in the glass showing a pale, solemn face I barely recognized as my own. The ink stain was a void over my heart. I felt its phantom weight, a physical manifestation of the worthlessness they had so carefully impressed upon my soul. My only solace was in my mind, in the secret world I had built for myself, a world of lines, angles, and stresses, of flying buttresses and golden ratios. In my small, cold room, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, were my drawings, fantastical cathedrals, elegant bridges, perfectly proportioned public halls. Architecture was my silent rebellion, a discipline of logic and beauty in a life devoid of both. It was a language I understood, a world where every piece had a purpose, where foundations were true and structures rose with integrity. Unlike the world I inhabited. Blackwood Manor was not a house, it was a declaration. Carved from dark, almost black granite, it rose from the earth like a challenge to the very sky. It was severe, yes, but it was also magnificent. Its lines were clean, its proportions perfect. It was a masterpiece of Palladian symmetry and Gothic ambition, a building that did not ask for admiration but commanded it. My heart, a small, trapped bird, beat a little faster. I forgot the stained dress, the stifling carriage, the impending humiliation. For a moment, I was just a student before a masterwork. I noted the precise fenestration, the masterful use of rustication on the lower level to ground the immense structure, the way the moonlight caught the sharp edges of the crenellations. It was breathtaking. It was honest. The ballroom was a river of light and sound. Hundreds of candles burned in crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into a million pieces, glinting off jewels and shimmering silks. The air was thick with perfume and the low hum of 100 conversations. I felt the ink stain on my dress like a brand. As instructed, I found a small alcove behind a monstrous fern, a pocket of shadow where I could fulfill my purpose, to be present but unseen. My father led Marion and Rosaline into the fray, his back straight for once as he presented his prized filly to the market. I watched them go, a familiar ache tightening my ribs. From my hiding place, I could observe. I saw the calculated smiles, the subtle power plays in the flick of a fan, the carefully curated introductions. And I saw him. The Duke of Vance. He stood near the grand fireplace, a figure of stark simplicity in a sea of frippery. He was dressed in black, unrelieved by color or ornamentation. He was taller than I had imagined, with a face that seemed carved from the same granite as his home. Severe was the right word. His expression was one of complete impassivity, his dark eyes missing nothing. He did not smile. He did not engage in the light chatter around him. He simply stood, a pillar of immense unmoving power, and the entire room orbited him. The music began, a soaring waltz, and the floor filled with color and movement. Rosaline, of course, was immediately claimed by a string of handsome, titled young men. Marion stood at the edge of the dance floor, her face a mask of smug satisfaction. My father had found the card room, and I remained in my corner, a forgotten piece of luggage. I did not mind. From here, I could study the room itself. The ceiling was a marvel of coffered geometry, each recessed panel perfectly balanced. The load-bearing columns were disguised as elegant Corinthian pillars, their acanthus leaves seeming to flower from the marble itself. It was brilliant. A space designed to feel impossibly vast and yet intimately connected. The architect had understood human scale, the psychology of space. I must have been lost in my analysis, my gaze tracing the lines of the vaulted ceiling, when a shadow fell over me. I started, my heart leaping into my throat. The Duke of Vance was standing before me. It was impossible. He had crossed the entire length of the ballroom, a journey through a parting sea of whispers and gasps, and he had stopped here, in my forgotten corner, at my feet. His eyes, which I had thought black from a distance, were a deep, startling gray, like a storm-tossed sea. They were not cold, as I had expected. They were still, a profound, unnerving stillness. He looked at me, his gaze direct and unwavering. It did not slide past me as everyone else's did. It landed. I felt pinned by it, seen in a way that was both terrifying and electrifying. For a dizzying moment, I thought he was going to reprimand me for lurking in the shadows. "You have been studying the ceiling for 10 minutes, he said. His voice was a low baritone, quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight of command. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. I could not find my own voice. My throat was a desert. I could only nod, a pathetic, jerky movement. I was acutely aware of the ink stain, a gaping wound on my chest. I wanted the floor to swallow me. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if I had given a satisfactory answer. His gaze flickered from my face down to my dress. I flinched, expecting a look of disgust, of dismissal, but his expression did not change. He simply observed the stain, his eyes lingering on it for a moment before returning to mine. There was no judgment in his look, only that same unnerving stillness, a quiet assessment. I felt a flush of heat crawl up my neck, a burning shame so intense it was almost a physical pain. The architect was a student of Vitruvius, he continued, his voice still low, meant for me alone. He believed that a building must have 3 qualities: firmitas, utilitas, venustas, strength, utility, and beauty. Most people only see the beauty. His eyes held mine. You, I think, were looking for the strength. My breath caught. He saw. He had not just seen me staring at the ceiling. He had understood what I was looking at. He had understood the direction of my thoughts. It was as if he had reached into my mind and plucked out my most secret passion. The shock of it was so profound that it momentarily eclipsed my fear. "The pendentives," I managed to whisper, the word scratching its way out of my throat. "They are masterfully done. To support such a wide dome, the transition from the square base is flawless." A flicker of something. Surprise? Interest? Passed through his gray eyes. It was there and gone in an instant. He looked at me for another long moment, a silence that stretched until I thought I might shatter from the tension. The entire ballroom seemed to have gone silent, though I knew it was only my perception. All I could hear was the frantic beating of my own heart. I saw Marion from the corner of my eye, her smile frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief and fury. Then, the Duke of Vance did the most impossible thing of all. He extended a gloved hand to me. "I find myself in need of a dance partner," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you seem to be the only person here who appreciates the foundations of this room. I require a partner who will not be distracted by the superficial." The world tilted on its axis. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The Duke of Vance, the cold, reclusive, untouchable Duke, who had not danced in a decade, was asking me. The invisible girl. The girl in the stained dress. He was asking me to dance. His hand remained suspended in the air between us, a silent, unyielding invitation. To refuse was unthinkable. To accept was terrifying. It was a leap into a spotlight so bright I was certain it would burn me alive. But in his eyes I saw not pity, but a spark of genuine intellectual curiosity. He was not rescuing me. He was engaging me. My hand, trembling, rose as if of its own accord and settled into his. His grip was firm, solid. As he led me from the shadows of the alcove and onto the polished marble of the dance floor, I felt hundreds of eyes on me. I could feel Marion's rage like a physical heat on my back. The music swelled, another waltz beginning as if on cue. The Duke placed a hand on my waist, his touch sending a jolt through the thin silk of my ruined gown. We began to move, my feet clumsy at first, my body rigid with shock. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice close to my ear. "It's only a dance, a series of predictable geometric movements. You should appreciate the structure." His words, so strange and yet so perfectly attuned to my own mind, settled me. I looked up at him, truly looked at him, and saw the faint lines of concentration around his eyes. He was guiding me with an effortless precision, his movements economical and sure. I began to relax to follow his lead. The steps of the waltz, which had always felt like a confusing ordeal, suddenly made sense, a pattern, a structure, like the plans for a building. I stopped stumbling. I found the rhythm. We moved together across the floor, a quiet island in a swirling sea of color. The whispers followed us, a sibilant tide. I ignored them. For the first time in my life, I was not invisible. I was seen, and it was the most terrifying, most wonderful feeling I had ever known. When the music ended, the silence that followed felt deafening. The Duke did not release me immediately. His hand remained on my waist, his gray eyes searching my face. "Your name," he said. It was not a request. "Elara Ashworth," I whispered. "Elara," he repeated, the name sounding foreign and significant on his tongue. He gave a formal bow. "I am the Duke of Vance." It was an absurd formality. Every person in the kingdom knew his name. Yet, the way he said it felt like a true introduction, a meeting of equals, not a duke condescending to a wallflower. He then escorted me not back to my shadowy corner, but to a small settee near the French doors, a place both visible and slightly removed from the main throng. Before I could process what was happening, a footman appeared with 2 glasses of champagne. The Duke had summoned him with a glance I hadn't even seen. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth," he said once we were seated, "what other flaws have you found in my home's design?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it startled a genuine answer from me. "There are no flaws," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of confidence. "It is a perfect marriage of form and function. The way the light from the eastern windows is designed to illuminate the grand staircase only in the morning, It shows a consideration for the passage of time, not just space. It is built to be lived in, not just admired. He watched me, his expression unreadable as I spoke. I felt a flush of embarrassment, certain I had overstepped, that my sudden enthusiasm was unseemly. I trailed off, my eyes falling to my lap. I apologize, Your Grace. I'm passionate about the subject. Do not apologize for passion, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It is the rarest and most valuable of commodities. He took a slow sip of his champagne, his eyes never leaving my face. There is a flaw, a minor one, in the West Wing library, a miscalculation in the load-bearing capacity of a crossbeam. It is almost imperceptible, but it is there. I have been told by 3 architects that it is of no consequence. He paused. I would be interested to hear your opinion. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was an invitation, a test, an opening into a world I had only ever dreamed of. I would be honored to see it, Your Grace. Alistair, he corrected me gently. My name is Alistair. Across the room I could see Marion watching us, her face a thunderous mask. Rosaline was beside her, looking utterly bewildered, her flock of suitors forgotten. My stepmother's plan, whatever it had been, had not just failed. It had backfired in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. She had intended to display me as an object of pity and contempt. Instead, the most powerful man in the room had singled me out, had treated me not just with courtesy, but with something that felt dangerously like intellectual respect. The ground beneath my feet, which had always felt like shifting sand, suddenly seemed solid. The next morning, a carriage bearing the ducal crest arrived at our door. The footman delivered a single thick card. It was an invitation for me, Elara Ashworth, to visit Blackwood Manor and inspect the library. Marion snatched it from my hands, her fingers digging into my arm. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper once the footman was gone. "What game are you playing, you wretched girl?" "I am playing no game," I replied, my own voice surprising me with its steadiness. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was joined by something new, a flicker of defiance. "The Duke has invited me." "He pities you," she spat, her face contorted with rage. "He danced with you because you were a pathetic spectacle. He is amusing himself at your expense, and you are too stupid to see it. You will make a fool of yourself and of this family." "Then I shall be a fool," I said, pulling my arm from her grasp. I met her furious gaze without flinching. "But I will go." For the first time in my life, she had no answer. She simply stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, utterly flummoxed by this unprecedented resistance. I turned and walked away, leaving her sputtering in the hall. In my room, I looked at my reflection. I was still the same plain girl. My dress was simple, my hair unadorned. But something in my eyes had changed. The resignation was gone, replaced by a terrifying, fragile spark of hope. I dressed with care in my only other presentable day dress, a simple navy blue wool. When I arrived at Blackwood Manor, I was not led to a formal receiving room, but was met by the Duke himself in the grand entrance hall. He was dressed not in formal attire, but in a simple linen shirt and riding breeches, looking more like a country squire than a duke. "Miss Ashworth," he said with a nod, "I'm glad you came." He led me to the library. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. 2 stories high, with towering shelves of books that reached a barrel-vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. A rolling ladder ran along a brass rail, and the air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. In the center of the room, a massive oak table was covered in scrolls and architectural drawings, and there, running across the ceiling, was the beam he had spoken of. I stood for a long time in silence, my eyes tracing the lines of the room, my mind calculating. I walked the length of the beam, my gaze fixed upwards. I saw it. A fractional bowing, a slight sag so infinitesimal that anyone else would have dismissed it as a trick of the light. But it was there, an imperfection in a room that was otherwise perfect. The weight of the books on the floor above, I said, thinking aloud. It was not accounted for in the original design. The beam is under constant, unanticipated stress. It will not fail tomorrow or next year. But in 50 years? 100? It will fail. Alistair said nothing. He simply walked to the large table and unrolled a set of old, brittle schematics. They were the original plans for the library. "Show me," he said. For the next 2 hours, we bent over the plans together. I forgot he was a duke. I forgot I was the girl in the stained dress. We were two minds focused on a single problem. I pointed out the flaw in the original calculations, the optimistic estimation of the wood's tensile strength. He listened, his gray eyes sharp with focus, asking precise, intelligent questions. He did not patronize me. He challenged me. He treated my ideas with the same seriousness as he would any master architect's. "My younger brother, Thomas, designed this wing," he said suddenly, his voice losing some of its crispness. He ran a hand over the plans, his touch surprisingly gentle. He was brilliant, far more brilliant than I. He saw the world in lines and angles, just as you do. He looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the tall windows. He died before it was completed. He fell. A balcony on a building he was inspecting gave way, poorly designed, insufficient support. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and heavy. I finally understood the source of his severity, the reason for his solitude. It was not coldness, it was grief, a grief so profound it had reshaped his world. And I understood his interest in me. It was not pity. When he looked at me, he saw a ghost of the passion his brother had possessed. "The beam can be reinforced," I said softly, my voice filled with a compassion I had not felt for anyone in years. A pair of decorative trusses, disguised as part of the original Gothic aesthetic. They would transfer the load to the main walls without altering the beauty of the room. I quickly sketched my idea on a spare piece of parchment, my fingers moving with a confidence I rarely felt outside the privacy of my own room. He studied my drawing for a long time. "Firmitas, utilitas, venustas," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he could not quite conceal. "Strength, utility, and beauty." Thomas would have approved. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw the faintest hint of a smile touch his lips. It transformed his severe face, lighting it from within. "Thank you, Elara." That day was the beginning. I was invited back to Blackwood Manor again and again. Ostensibly, it was to consult on the library renovations, but our conversations soon strayed to literature, to philosophy, to the history etched into the stones of his estate. We would walk the grounds for hours, and he would tell me stories of his family, of his responsibilities, of the crushing weight of his title. In turn, I found myself telling him of my secret world of drawings, of my longing for a life of purpose. With him, I did not have to be invisible. My thoughts, my ideas, my very essence, he saw it all and did not find it wanting. He sent me gifts. Not jewels or gowns, but rare books on architecture, fine drafting tools, and a beautiful leather-bound portfolio for my drawings. Each gift was a quiet acknowledgement of who I was, not who society expected me to be. A slow, tentative warmth began to thaw the ice around my heart. I began to hope again, that fragile, dangerous thing. At home, Marion's fury simmered. She could not forbid me from going to the Duke, for his favor was too great a social prize to discard. But she made my life a quiet hell. There were endless backhanded comments, helpful suggestions that I was making a fool of myself, and constant reminders of my plainness compared to Rosaline's beauty. Rosaline, for her part, was mostly confused. She could not comprehend the Duke's interest in me. "But you don't even talk about fashion," she said once, her brow furrowed in genuine perplexity. What could you possibly have to say to him? To her, it was an unsolvable riddle. One afternoon, as Alistair and I were sitting in a sun-drenched conservatory, our hands brushed as we both reached for a book. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand and laced his fingers through mine. His touch was warm and strong. We sat there in silence for a long time, our hands intertwined, a silent conversation passing between us that was more profound than any words we had ever spoken. The world outside, with its judgment and its cruelty, melted away. In that moment, there was only the quiet strength of his hand holding mine. It felt like coming home. That evening, I returned to a house crackling with a strange tension. Marion greeted me with a smile that was all teeth. "Elara, darling," she said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness, "we have the most wonderful news. Lord Bromwell has made an offer for you." The blood drained from my face. Lord Bromwell was a man 3 times my age, with a cruel reputation and breath that smelled of sour wine. He was looking for a 3rd wife to serve as a nursemaid to his brood of unpleasant children. "What?" I whispered. "He's a man of good standing," my father said, appearing at Marion's side. He looked haggard, his eyes pleading with me to understand, to comply, to make things easy. "It is a very suitable match." "I will not marry him," I said, my voice low and shaking. Marion's smile vanished. "You will do as you are told," she snapped. "This flirtation with the Duke is over. It is an embarrassment. He is toying with you, and it is time for this foolishness to end. The contracts are being drawn up. You will marry Lord Bromwell at the end of the month." I realized then what she was doing. She could not control the Duke, so she was removing me from the board entirely. Marrying me off to a boorish old man would sever my connection to Alistair forever and put me firmly back in my place. It was a checkmate. I fled to my room, my heart a block of ice. The hope that had so recently bloomed was being systematically ripped out by the roots. I was trapped. Marion had finally found a way to cage me for good. Despair washed over me, cold and absolute. I sat in the dark, the moon a sliver of uncaring light in the window. My drawings, my books from Alistair, they all seemed like relics from another life, a life that was now over. I saw my future stretching before me, a long gray road of servitude to a cruel man, my mind and spirit slowly starving to death in a gilded cage. Marion had won. Her victory was complete. Late that night, I overheard them arguing. My father's weak protests were no match for Marion's sharp, cutting tones. "She needs to be dealt with. Do you have any idea how precarious our situation is? If the Duke finds out about the trust, we are ruined." The trust? What trust? A cold sliver of suspicion worked its way through my despair. I pressed my ear to the door. "He will not find out," my father mumbled. "No one knows about her mother's dowry trust but us and the solicitor." "And that solicitor is old and forgetful," Marion hissed. "This is the only way. Marry her off, send her away, and the Duke will lose interest. He will turn his attention to Rosaline, as he should have from the beginning. Everything will be put right." My mother's dowry, a trust, a fortune that was meant for me. Fortune. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. My poverty, my simple dresses, the constant narrative that I was a financial burden. It was all a lie. A monstrous, calculated lie designed to keep me subjugated and ignorant while they spent my inheritance on Rosaline's gowns and jewels. The betrayal was so profound, it stole my breath. It was not just cruelty, it was theft. It was the erasure of my mother's legacy. The next day, a letter arrived for the Duke. I saw Marion hand it to the footman herself, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. A terrible premonition seized me. She was not just marrying me off, she was salting the earth. She was destroying my reputation with Alistair to ensure he would never look for me, never question my sudden departure. 2 days passed in an agony of silence. I was a prisoner in my own home, my meals brought to my room, the doors to the outside world locked to me. The wedding preparations began. I wept until I had no tears left, my brief season of hope collapsing into a winter of absolute despair. I had been a fool to believe, a fool to think I could ever escape. On the 3rd day, another ducal carriage arrived. This time it was not a simple invitation. It was a summons. My father, Baroness Marion, Rosaline, and I were all requested to attend the Duke of Vance at Blackwood Manor at once. Not requested, commanded. Marion was triumphant. "You see," she whispered to me as we dressed, "he has received my letter. He wishes to inform you personally that he is done with your pathetic little games. He will likely announce his intention to court Rosaline." She pinched my arm hard. "You will be silent, and you will be grateful. Do you understand?" I understood. I understood that I was walking into my own execution. We were shown into the Duke's main drawing room. It was an imposing space, formal and severe. Alistair was not alone. An elderly, stern-looking man in legal robes stood beside him. Alistair himself looked as if he were carved from ice. His face was a mask of cold fury, and his gray eyes were glacial. When he looked at me, just for a second, I saw a flash of something else, pain, concern, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He did not greet us. He simply gestured to the chairs opposite his desk. "Baroness," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth, "I received your letter." He held up a piece of paper, a most illuminating piece of correspondence. Marion preened, settling into her chair. "Your Grace, I felt it was my duty to inform you. Elara is a troubled girl, prone to fantasy and delusion. We were so worried her attentions were becoming a nuisance to you." "Your letter claims," Alistair continued, his voice lethally calm, "that Miss Ashworth is mentally unstable, that she is a compulsive liar, and that her parentage is in question, suggesting she is the illegitimate product of an affair her mother had and is therefore not entitled to the Ashworth name or any inheritance." He let the words hang in the air, each one a drop of poison. "A most unfortunate family secret," Marion said, dabbing at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "We have protected her from the shame of it all her life." I stared at her, my blood running cold. This was the depth of her wickedness. She would not just steal my fortune, she would steal my very identity, my mother's honor. Alistair's eyes flickered to the lawyer. "Mr. Davies, you were the solicitor for the late Lady Ashworth, were you not?" The old lawyer, who I now recognized, nodded grimly. "I was, Your Grace, and I can attest under oath that Elara Ashworth is the sole legitimate heir of Baron Ashworth and his first wife, Lady Eleanor. I can also attest," he continued, fixing my father with a withering glare, "to the existence of a dowry trust established by Lady Eleanor for her daughter, a trust which has been illegally accessed and systematically drained by the Baron and his second wife for the last 10 years. He produced a ledger. The silence in the room was absolute. Marion's face had gone from smug to ashen. My father seemed to shrink into his chair, his face a mottled gray. "Your letter, Baroness," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "was a grave miscalculation. You assumed I was a fool. You assumed my interest in Elara was a passing whim, that I could be swayed by petty gossip and slander. But my interest in Elara is not based on her social standing or her family's reputation. It is based on her character, her integrity, her mind, qualities you would not understand." He stood up, walking around the desk to stand before them. He was a towering figure of righteous anger. "You have committed fraud. You have slandered an innocent woman. You have attempted to force her into a marriage against her will to cover your crimes. You are not just a social climber, madam. You are a thief and a monster." Marion leaped to her feet. "Lies! This is all her doing. The girl has manipulated you, poisoned you against us." Her voice was a shrill, desperate shriek. And then I found my voice. It rose from a deep, forgotten well of pain and rage inside me. "No," I said, my voice clear and strong. It cut through her hysteria, silencing the room. I stood, my hands clenched at my sides, and I faced her. I faced them all. "You did this," I said, looking directly at Marion. "For years you have told me I was worthless, that I was a burden, that I was stupid, plain, and unlovable. You made me believe it. You built a prison of shame around me and told me it was a home. You let me wear a stained dress to a ball, not just to humiliate me, but to remind me that I deserved nothing better than rags and shadows." I turned to my father. "And you," I said, my voice breaking with a decade of unshed tears. "You stood by and let her do it. You let her erase my mother. You let her steal my inheritance. You let her break my spirit because you were too weak, too cowardly to stand up to her. You chose a quiet life over your own daughter." I looked at Rosaline, who was weeping silently, her face a mask of horrified realization. "And you just watched. You never saw because you never looked." Finally, I faced Marion again. The fear was gone, burned away by the clean fire of truth. "You tried to take everything from me, my home, my name, my future, my mother's memory. But you cannot have my mind, you cannot have my integrity, and you cannot have my spirit. It is not for sale. It is not yours to break. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I am Elara Ashworth, daughter of Eleanor Ashworth, and I am not invisible anymore. The room was utterly still. Alistair stood beside me, his presence a solid, unwavering wall of support. He did not speak for me. He had simply cleared the ground so that I could speak for myself. He had given me my voice back. "Baron," Alistair said, his voice like the cracking of a glacier, "you will restore every penny of Elara's trust. You will publicly retract the engagement to Lord Bromwell. The Baroness will remove herself from society and retire to your most remote country estate, permanently. If you fail to do any of these things, Mr. Davies will file charges with the Crown. You will be ruined, imprisoned, and stripped of your title. Am I clear?" My father, broken, could only nod. Marion collapsed into her chair, a wild, guttural sob escaping her. It was the sound of a tyrant whose power had just evaporated into dust. Rosaline came to my side, her hand hesitantly touching my arm. "Elara," she whispered, her face streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry, I never knew." I looked at her, and for the first time I saw not a rival, but a sister, another victim of Marion's manipulations. I gave her a small, brief nod of acknowledgement. Alistair placed a hand on the small of my back. "Elara," he said softly, "let us go." He led me from the room, leaving the wreckage of my former life behind. He took me to the library, our sanctuary. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He led me to the window seat and sat beside me, taking both of my hands in his. His gray eyes were soft, filled with a deep, aching tenderness. "I'm sorry you had to endure that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "When I received her letter, the vile things she wrote, I knew instantly that they were lies, because I know you." "How?" I whispered, my whole body trembling with the aftershocks of the confrontation. "How could you be so sure?" "Because I have been watching you for a very long time, Elara," he confessed, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "Long before the ball. I saw you at a musicale last year. You were standing in the back and everyone was fawning over the performers. But you were looking at the ceiling, at the acoustics of the room. I heard you explain to your sister, who wasn't listening, how the shape of the arches amplified the sound. I saw a mind at work, a brilliant, curious mind, in a world that only values pretty faces. I have been looking for a partner, not a decoration. I have been looking for you." Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of catharsis, of a pain so old I had forgotten its source being washed away. He had seen me. Even when I was invisible, he had seen me. "I am not rescuing you, Elara," he said, his voice earnest and low. "You are not a damsel in distress. You are the strongest person I have ever met. You survived a war of attrition waged against your own soul. I am simply opening a door. What I want is to walk through it with you, as your partner, as your equal, as your husband." He did not kneel. He did not present a ring. He simply looked into my eyes, his soul laid bare in his gaze. He was offering me a life, a future, a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect and intellectual passion, a foundation that was strong, useful, and beautiful. "Yes," I breathed, the word a prayer of profound relief and dizzying joy. "Alistair, yes." He leaned in, and his lips met mine. The kiss was not a fiery explosion, but a deep, quiet claiming. It was the end of a very long winter. It was the feeling of a perfectly balanced arch, settling into its keystone, strong and true. It was the feeling of being, at long last, home. 1 year later, I stood on a windswept hill overlooking the sea, a set of architectural plans held firmly in my hands against the breeze. Alistair, my husband, stood beside me, his arm wrapped securely around my waist. The plans were for a new conservatory and public library, a gift from the Duke and Duchess of Vance to the nearby town. The design was mine. My father had repaid my dowry. Marion was a recluse in the country, her power broken forever. Rosaline had written to me, a hesitant but sincere letter of apology, and we were slowly, carefully, building a true sisterhood. But here, with Alistair, was where I lived. We spent our days in his library, our evenings by the fire, our lives intertwined in a constant, flowing conversation of minds and souls. He had not just given me a title or a home. He had given me a space to become myself. He had looked at the girl in the stained dress, hidden in the shadows, and had seen not the stain, but the person underneath. He had seen the strength of the foundation. And together, we were building a life more beautiful than any cathedral I could ever have designed alone. I was no longer invisible. I was finally and completely seen.